So the first thing that I'm going to ask Barry and Bess to do is to introduce themselves.
My primary was diagnosed 31 years ago, and I was a young mother with young children like Abigail, and I did fine for almost 5 years, and then the cancer metastasized in my sternum. And I still was a young mother with young kids. The state of the technology for metastatic cancer patients was worse than in its infancy at that time. I was fortunate enough to have a very highly educated scientific family who convinced one of the 5 doctors who told me to go home and die that I should take some experimental treatment. She wrote to the FDA, got a compassionate use permission to treat me, and I was treated for a year. I survived that episode for 25 years. And during that time, I immediately, as soon as I was eligible, I signed up for Reach to Recovery to be a counselor. And over the last 25 years, I've advocated one-on-one for somewhere around 350 patients, most of them ladies, few guys, but most of them ladies. And then about 5 years ago, right after I retired, I found the Quality of Life Committee at the Montana Cancer Coalition. And what we do is try to connect all sorts of cancer patients all over Montana, not only those living in our tiny little cities, but also those on the reservation and those on the frontier with care, good care of all kinds. And our current project is an educational program for primary care physicians and trying to get them to a place where they're very comfortable taking over the care of survivors. And then a year ago, one of my Reach to Recovery patients was Vanessa. And when I found Vanessa, she was already actively engaged in trying to promote the passage of some very important national legislation. She and her brother had been just kind of floundering around trying to figure out how to do this, but she had already had meetings with the offices of her senators, who are Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul.
Wow.
She had been very aggressive, but without much backing. So at that point, we started looking for a home and other people who were passionate about these particular issues. And we found that METAvivor was exactly the place we needed to be. And thanks to Barry and Dan Kramer, who's not here today, we kind of spontaneously formed a advocacy planning or strategy subcommittee of the advocacy committee, and basically just doing some back office work for the larger committee. And as Barry will mention, we have been so honored and energized and thrilled to be part of this organization, because they're small, but they're mighty. They're a get her done kind of group of people. So that's, and I just recurred 6 weeks ago. So I'm back in the fray. I'm fighting again. And fortunately, in the last 25 years, the technology has improved, the treatments have improved, and we're hoping to fight the good fight for as long as we can.
Thank you, Bess, for that background. Sorry, for some reason I didn't realize that you were living with MBC, but you just are so vibrant and you have so much energy. Like a lot of us, people forget that MBC can still be wreaking havoc on the inside, even though we're able to remain pretty put together on the outside. So I appreciate your introduction there. Barry, would you like to go next and talk a little bit about your connection with MBC?
Certainly. In April of 2018, my partner Shara was diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer, which is a insidious form of metastatic breast cancer that is not susceptible to detection by mammograms or by screening. Her first line treatment, Ibrance, lasted oh just about a year before it stopped working, and she went on several other treatments until finally the available treatments ran out. She passed away this last January. Shortly after she was diagnosed, I began researching metastatic breast cancer, ran across MetaVivor, made contact. Well, first of all, I had the concept or the desire to reach out to my legislators to encourage increased research funding. And it turned out that MetaVivor's legislative consultants I had worked with some more decades ago than I care to reveal on the subject of crib death. And we were extremely successful in ultimately finding a treatment that almost eliminated that source of infant mortality. Fast forwarding, I had arranged to become a local contact for MetaVivor for purposes of going to Congress. The former local contact had become unable to continue in that regard. So I visited a number of congressional offices with the consultants, and then later became involved in MetaVivor's signature campaign, at that time the Stampede, which was an opportunity for people from all over the country to come to DC and to meet and educate their congressional delegation. I next year served on the Stampede Committee, and then the year after that was elected to the board, and I now serve as Director of Advocacy for MetaVivor. We have currently renamed our Stampede Committee to the Advocacy Committee because it's our intent to pursue year-round advocacy efforts instead of just for the Stampede. So currently this year we have 3 priority areas. One is appropriations. We've already had an action alert and a virtual campaign around the appropriations process. Coming up in a month to 2 months will be our signature legislative priorities, which involve both, and we'll talk in more detail about this later, but better financial support and backing for people with metastatic breast cancer, and also trying to reduce or eliminate insurance company manipulation of out-of-pocket expenses. And then finally, we will repeat the Stampede in the fall, which is about the time that Congress begins passing the legislation that they've been working on all year. So again, we have year-round advocacy planned now in these form of these 3 campaigns, and then in future years, our hope is to even increase the frequency of our action alerts and our priorities. That kind of gets you to date.
Barry also neglected to say that he did go to law school, so he does have a little bit of that legal background as well.
Please don't hold that against me.
Caroline, I see you here, but your camera's not on, which is totally fine. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm involved with the MetaVivor Advocacy Committee as well. My name is Caroline, and I'm in Northern Virginia. So I'm actually pretty close to Barry. And I'm trying to think, I've been involved with MetaVivor for a while. I sort of found MetaVivor too, as after I had my metastatic diagnosis, and was just looking for organizations doing advocacy work around, just different aspects of metastatic breast cancer. Came across MetaVivor, and they just were really, the best organization in terms of being targeted specifically at metastatic breast cancer. Yeah, trying to think what else. So I'm not working now, and I'm focusing a lot on different kinds of advocacy work. So trying to make some impact in that respect, but it's a long, hard slog where it takes a lot of us just trying to be persistent.
And Caroline, how long have you been living with MBC?
They first saw the tumors in 2014, but I actually didn't get a diagnosis to 2017. So
hard to know specifically how long, but at least the 4 years since the diagnosis.
right.
Okay. So each of you seem to kind of incorporate into your answer about introducing yourself as to why the advocacy committee is so important. So I just wanted to address that quickly. So I'm also on the advocacy committee for METAvivor. And I think that it boils down for me to basically that legislative and policy advocacy is just super important to me. It's definitely a niche for me, and METAvivor is the group of people that I wanted to do that with. Because as has been mentioned previously, it's laser focused on metastatic patients. So as I've shared before with other people, there are advocacy committees with a lot of other organizations. There's trainings with a lot of other organizations, including the Metastatic Breast Cancer Network, and others, the American Cancer Society. There are lots of organizations that have these groups that then go lobby Congress for various remedies. But the thing that sets METAvivor apart, in my opinion, is that we're focusing on the metastatic community, the metastatic breast cancer community, whereas these other organizations have a wider focus. And so a lot of times our agendas overlap. A lot of times, even when I'm doing some legislative calls, I'm inviting people maybe from Force or from other organizations even to come with me to some of the meetings so that we have, present a united front. But whereas their focus is a little bit wider, ours is laser focused on the metastatic community, which is what I appreciate. So I'm going to call on Barry next to talk about how this committee fits into the board's organization and just how he, as a board member, and how METAvivor is looking at how legislative advocacy fits into the overall agenda.
When METAvivor began, its first and major priority was fundraising for medical research. In fact, 100% of all donations went to fund medical research. The advocacy was thought of as important, but didn't receive the same priority. It was a secondary area. In recent years, we've seen the growth of involvement by the organization advocacy to the point where now it stands as an equal priority for, along with fundraising. The board sets its annual priorities at the beginning of the year, and the advocacy committee follows out those priorities with program and implementation. The priorities for this year are, first of all, the increased funding for medical research. Secondly, the advocacy of the Metastatic Breast Cancer Access to Care Act, which provides the elimination of actually, I'm going to stop right there and give some background, and then I'll talk about what we're trying to do. Under the Social Security law, there is a 5-month waiting period before you can get Social Security disability benefits. Once your benefits have been granted, there is an additional 24-month waiting period before you can qualify for Medicare as a secondary insurance. One of our legislative priorities is called the Metastatic Breast Cancer Access to Care Act, and that eliminates these waiting periods. When you consider that the average longevity for an individual who's been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer is 33 months after the date of diagnosis. Effectively, these waiting periods eliminate the possibility of getting any financial support from the government for somebody with MBC. So again, this legislation would eliminate those waiting periods, and it's a critical priority when you out-of-pocket expenses for treating metastatic breast cancer can easily mount up to the tens of thousands per year. I've seen some cases where $60,000 a year out of pocket alone have been the case. And I suspect even more. In Shara's case, because of the insurance she was covering, we had basically an average of about $25,000 a year. But when you consider that an individual with metastatic breast cancer is unable to work and then is faced with those kinds of out-of-pocket expenses, there are people dying simply because they can't afford medical treatment. And so that is one of the reasons why this is a priority. Second legislative priority that the board has set is called the Cancer Drug Parity Act. And that eliminates manipulation of out-of-pocket expenses by insurers. As the law currently allows, insurers can charge one copay for a treatment in a doctor's office and a much larger copay for the same or similar treatment at home or in a hospital. There are these differentials that make no sense at all, but just allow insurance companies to charge more and make more money. What this legislation attempts to do is to standardize those expenses, prevent insurance company manipulation. As one example, an individual was told that in their doctor's office, they would have to pay $60,000 for a course of chemo. They later learned that across the street in a hospital, they could get the same course of chemo for just a fraction of that amount. So the differences here are just astounding. And this is again a second legislative priority if you count appropriations. This third legislative priority, and then another priority area is combination legislative and regulatory. It involves what is known as the SEER, or Survey Epidemiology End Result Registry. Just very simply, it is the way that National Cancer Institute tries to keep track of cancer. It undercounts breast cancer, metastatic breast cancer in particular, dramatically. It was established in 1973 when people with metastatic breast cancer basically didn't survive very long, and so they never even considered it. Because it doesn't pick up metastatic recurrence, and therefore research money is under allocated to this field because it's not seen as a problem. The other thing which the SEER registry doesn't do is when someone has, let's say, metastatic breast cancer, which spreads to the brain or another area and causes death, they record it as brain cancer, not metastatic breast cancer. Accordingly, again, research is underfunded because this is seen as less of a priority. So one of the advocacy issues that the board has authorized the advocacy committee to emphasize is SEER modernization. And we can talk a little bit more about how we're doing that later, but I just wanted to outline the board's priorities and how the advocacy committee is pursuing them.
Thank you, Barry. And that's some of those technical things that trying to explain to these health staffers can get a little complicated because there's a lot of verbiage and there's a lot of different language there. And sometimes the health staffers don't fully understand what the implication is. And so one of the things that I love about MetaVivor's advocacy efforts is that those of us who live and breathe a lot of this stuff, we take care of the technical pieces. We train the state captains on the technical pieces, and then constituents are invited to simply come and tell their stories. I was part of interviewing Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz recently for the Our MBC podcast, and she just went on and on and on about the power of storytelling and how each of us has the impactful story to tell these legislators. And we can talk about the Drug Parity Act, we can talk about SEER and get into the weeds of all of those details, but at the end of the day, the health staffers and our congresspeople need to know why. Why is it important that something like SEER get updated? And that story that Barry told about someone being asked for $60,000 in order to get chemotherapy, that was my dad, because my mom needed to get chemotherapy and the person asked for 60 grand while she was already hooked up to get chemotherapy, because they were in a location where they were allowed to charge that amount of money under my parents' insurance policy, and they could literally walk across the street and go to the hospital, and their copay was like $250. So $250 versus 60 grand for the same exact medication given in the same exact way. So to me, that drug has a lot of very personal implications as well. Yes, would you talk a little bit about the advocacy toolkit and why the advocacy committee was putting together that toolkit for people who are wanting to get involved and learn how to do this type of advocacy?
Sure. I think in part it was already a dream of Barry's and Dan's, and then I started whining and it kind of became front and center to what we were doing, and I think the reason is real simple. We, the three of us here, know we're on borrowed time, as you mentioned, Abigail, and it's like, let's get something done right now. Whatever we can do, it doesn't have to be perfect. We just have to get something that we can use to attract state captains and attract constituents, such that people are dripping on their national legislators all the time. And as Barry mentioned, METAvivor has this wonderful Stampede program that has been very successful. And we thought, if it's that good one time during the year, maybe we can really kind of ramp up that concept and attract more people, do things for them, so that we're not just asking them once a year and just leaving them alone. We're sending information to them, not just about the wonderful research that METAvivor does, but about advocacy issues, and offering them resources, in particular offering resources so that they feel confident and well prepared when they contact their legislators. And of course, it's also a how-to. This is how you do it, step by step by step. So it makes it less scary, way more accessible to people, or at least that's what we're hoping. And with a goal, of course, of expanding the number of advocates we have throughout the country, and raising the consciousness, by doing so, raising the consciousness of all of our legislators, even if they won't do much of anything for us, they at least know that we're out there. And I will say that in my case, I don't know that I mentioned this earlier, I'm the state captain for Montana, first Montana state captain METAvivor's had, to my knowledge. Thank you. But one thing that was super important here was communicating. I have one senator who is utterly deaf, about most things that are important to people, but one who just didn't know we existed and did not know that these issues were important. The end result, and there were some interim steps, by the way, but the end result was that he just co-sponsored the Metastatic Breast Cancer Access to Care Act. So, I mean, this was a complete shift from knowing nothing to, to being a strong supporter, and that's what we're after.
And one thing mentioned, Bess, along that line, according to our legislative consultant, we have several of the most popular bills in Congress in terms of the number of co-sponsors. This has taken work. It's taken a number of years of effort and grassroots involvement to get there. And so we're looking at, we think, definite chance of passage, hopefully this year. Obviously can't guarantee anything, but we've come a long way due to grassroots involvement. It's really been incredible.
That is the style of advocacy that MetaVivor has embraced, is this idea of grassroots advocacy. And Dan, who wasn't able to be here today because of a family obligation, which is always more important than doing something like this, he comes from that background and brings that expertise to the committee. Barry, would you like to talk about what Dan does and his expertise a little bit more?
Dan is a grassroots organizing consultant. He works with nonprofits all over the country on how to generate grassroots involvement and participation. We're very, very, fortunate that he has volunteered his services for MetaVivor. His wife, Cassie, has been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. The importance of this grassroots advocacy just can't be overstated. We are, legislators will ignore often people who are not the constituents. You need a constituent to gain their ear. And we currently have, at last count, 38 state captains. We developed state captains from our Stampede last year, which is the first virtual Stampede due to COVID. And now we have 38. We're trying to assemble more. Our goal is to have a state captain in every state. But this has made an incredible difference in terms of our effectiveness in Capitol Hill. And our hope is, in terms of advocacy, to also add a state level of advocacy as well. What Dan has been doing for MetaVivor, he's developed an advocacy toolkit, which is designed for people who want to become involved but are not sure how to do so. It's a simple step-by-step guide for how to become involved, how to become an advocate for on behalf of the metastatic breast cancer community. In addition to that, it provides a number of additional resources and ultimately contact information for anybody that wants to discuss this further or get more guidance. We anticipate that with a little more development that the toolkit will be posted on MetaVivor's website, as well as being sent out more generally to people who have registered for involvement in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barry. And it is amazing to me as we meet more people who have been touched by metastatic breast cancer, is that it's everyone, right? At various levels. And it is certainly something that does not discriminate in any way in terms of who develops metastatic breast cancer. So Carolyn, I think that you are also a state captain, but would you perhaps go over for our listeners, other than the few states that we're still developing state captains for, if someone listening to this webinar wanted to get involved with legislative or policy advocacy, how would they do that? And what kinds of things are we looking to recruit for?
I have been a co-captain with Barry, and actually he takes on an awful lot of those duties. So I kind of just co-captain. During the stampede, we worked to kind of organize our interaction with the legislative offices on Capitol Hill. And then we set up times to talk with, it's usually staff. I mean, in an ideal circumstance, it could be a member of Congress, but more often it's legislative staff. And we really just give them a little bit of background on MetaVivor, what our issues and concerns are. And then we share insight on our personal experiences and how changes to policy and legislation could be helpful to us as constituents. We try to match up people from their own legislative district, but obviously the rest of us are from within the state when we meet with them as a group. We're actual constituents that they're representing, and that tends to have much more sway than just some random lobbyist coming in and talking about an issue. We let them know what our concerns are. During the course of the year, I think, you alluded to trying to move to a more year-round format, and we just want to keep our issues in front of legislators at the federal level. Sometimes we can also do that at the state level. Sometimes there are state actions that can impact us and our legislative priorities as well. And so just make sure that our legislators are aware of our issues and concerns, and try to keep those in front of them. And also just, kind of keep everybody briefed as much as possible on, as a group, what's going on around the country, what's going on with legislative priorities, and how we can try to get some traction on those issues.
Thank you for outlining that. Would it be correct to say, and anybody can take this, take the answer to this question up, but that the average person who's wanting to get involved, that the only assignment that they would have would be to share their personal story? Is that an accurate thing to say to just anybody who might want to get involved?
I'd say that that's the most important thing that they can do. Legislators are most open to hearing people's stories. That has the most impact. The issues are something that can be learned to varying degrees, but the thing which will really change legislators' mind is to hear your personal story. You just can't overemphasize the importance of that.
Barry, you alluded a little bit to SEER and how the that particular database does not count those of us who go from an early breast cancer stage and then progress to a stage 4. And I know you met recently with SEER on behalf of METAvivor. So would you be able to give everybody an update on where they are at in terms of updating their antiquated system, which I think didn't Nixon sign it into law, something like that?
That's exactly right. It's at this point almost ancient history. We met with a team from SEER who was assigned the task of working on modernizing SEER. They have developed a number of pilot projects in different locales to track metastatic recurrence, and then depending upon the result of these pilot projects, they can then implement them more generally. We've also asked them for some follow-up information that they recently provided in a letter. We're analyzing that. We have a team of people, including people with statistical expertise and research expertise, to go over that and make suggestions and see what further directions we might be able to provide. So we're at the point of analyzing the information they've given us and then seeing how best to go forward.
Bess, do you want to talk a little bit about why it's important for them to count us properly?
There are a couple of reasons. Number one is the way they're counting us now is wrong. It's scientifically incorrect. So what they're doing is lying, essentially. That's
Can't get more direct than that, right?
right. I mean, that's where it's at but it's not number one. I mean, that's kind of number two. Number one is, there are about 300,000 people in this country living with metastatic breast cancer. And I think it's important for the public and legislators and kind of everybody to understand that very few people die from any type of primary cancer. Virtually anyone who dies from cancer dies when it invades the rest of the body from wherever it started. And in general, it is a true statement that many primary cancers, in the case of breast cancer, about a third of them come back to haunt patients later in life at some point. So, we're talking about something that's very widespread, but very poorly understood, I think, in the popular mind.
And just to add to what Bess is saying, appropriations of research funding follow the statistics of the incidence of cancer. And so if SEER is dramatically undercounting metastatic breast cancer, then our research funding is going to be much smaller accordingly. And in fact, it is. If you count both public and private funding together, we fund less than 7% of all peer-reviewed research proposals in the metastatic breast cancer field. So, we need to get more accurate figures in order to get research funding levels that reflect the true figures. We need to understand, in terms of cause of death, for example, whether we have metastatic cancer as the original cause or not, sort of as Bess said, because let me just give an example to simplify. If you have metastatic breast cancer, it spreads to the brain, causes death. It may well be that treating brain cancer is going to pose more of a challenge, in that you can best reduce brain cancer deaths by research and developing more treatments for metastatic breast cancer. I mean, in order to understand the metastatic progression, and in order to deal with areas or aspects to cancer that may be very difficult to treat, you need to get a much better understanding of the origins of that cancer.
And you guys were throwing out numbers and percentages, right? Like 300,000 people, like 30% of people will become metastatic after an early stage diagnosis. All numbers that are statistical good guesses, right? Yep. That we're looking at the information we have, we're extrapolating from SEER, we're looking at what we know and backing into some of these percentages, but we don't know them for sure because they are extrapolations. They are using the information that we have. And so it would be very helpful also from an advocacy perspective to know for sure that there's a constituency of 300,000, that 30% of people diagnosed with early stage breast cancer, meaning 1 to 3, will then become metastatic after a period of time. These are all things that will help us from an advocacy perspective get more money, like Barry was talking about. But they're somewhat in dispute right now. I think there's a lot of people on both sides of the fence who say that numbers could be interpreted different ways. And that's what it is with statistics. You can interpret statistics in different ways. So getting those solid numbers that we can all rely on will be very important so that it's not something that is in dispute.
So we've gotten a couple amens in the chat, people who were also very much in agreement with the trials and tribulations that come with health insurance and whether you can get health insurance or not, and being actually discriminated against potentially, reprimanded, for example, if you did not get and apply for Medicare at the age of 62 and then needing to go into this waiting period. I was actually wanting to piggyback off of some of the numbers and percentages you guys were mentioning. Very recently, I was giving a presentation. And again, these numbers are on the low estimate because of everything you guys mentioned. That's probably not accurate, but these are just extrapolations with 43,000, correct me, sorry, jump in here, of people who are going to die from metastatic breast cancer this year.
It keeps going up. Yes. I think when I was first diagnosed, we were looking at 114 every day in the United States. A couple of years ago, it went up to 116. I think we're up to 118 a day now. And the population where diagnoses are increasing is under 40, whereas the diagnoses of women over 40 has stayed pretty static.
You know, and we talked about numbers and extrapolating numbers, but here's something that has nothing to do with numbers, but has everything to do with SEER, and that is, if without research that directly pertains to metastatic breast cancer patients, what they'd be treating me for right now is liver cancer. Wrong cancer, wrong treatment, you know, dead within months. Whereas understanding the fact that this is a recurrence of metastatic breast cancer will buy me much more time with targeted therapies that are known to work for patients and give them quality, as much optimize their quality of life and survival. So yeah, that's the only thing that I wanted. You know, all the numbers aside, you've got to have good information, and the only way you can do that is with research. And the only way we get research funds, not the only way, but one of the main ways we get research funds is when Congress gives them to us, basically.
Right.
For good quality.
Which is why the Appropriations Committee is such an important committee to get to know and make sure that we're advocating directly to them, which is why that was one of the targets for this year, the goals for this year.
I just want to encourage anyone who is interested to become involved. There are several ways, but probably the easiest is just to email info@metavivor.org and indicate that you would like to become involved in your state. As I say, most states have a state captain. We can coordinate and make contact with that state captain for you and get you involved. You don't have to be an expert in any of this. You just have to be willing to tell your story. And please don't get intimidated or overwhelmed by all of this. You know, we can provide you the support that you need to feel more comfortable. But the main thing is just your voice and your story.
But be thinking about your word, Barry. Carolyn, can we come over to you? Is there anything else that you would like to share that you haven't had a chance to share yet?
I think what really sort of sustains me, motivates me, and I feel really passionate about is something we've kind of alluded to, but we just really have to make sure that everyone has access to care. It just, I figured that out really early on, is that, you know, if you do not have access to care, then the rest of this is all just sort of, yeah, well, it'd be nice to have more research, but since I can't get any care to begin with, or if it's going to bankrupt me, that's a serious problem. METAvivor is trying to do more on improving that through the Metastatic Breast Cancer Access to Care Act. And, you know, there are a lot of other organizations that are interested in that legislation as well. Yeah, there are issues of equity around this. You know, there's the craziness of the person in the next chair can be paying a completely, or across the street, as you said, Abigail, can be paying a completely different price for their care than you are. There are just so many different issues, and we really, we have to keep fighting to make sure that everybody has access to care.
Such an excellent point to look at, access to care. And one of the things that I love about METAvivor is that through the board, through this committee, METAvivor is really looking to simplify something that's really complicated so that anybody can be a part of it and break it down into consumable tasks for each individual. So if you want to get involved in terms of just sharing your story, that's huge, and that's one of the most important things. If you want to get involved by being an organizer or being somebody who's taking on a little bit more responsibility, there's the state captain or co-captaining a state. If you want to get even more involved, we're always looking for people to join the committee so that we have more hands. What is the phrase? Many hands make light work, make work light. I don't know, something like that. It helps to have lots of hands. It helps to have lots of people working, and there's always more. There's always more to do. But the one thing that I really want everybody to take away from this webinar is that even if the ask or the big question, the big picture is complicated, the only ask of you as an individual, as a constituent, is talk about yourself. And that is something that everybody is equipped to do. Even if public speaking is something that scares you, we can make it easy for you and help you through that process. But the only ask is to come tell your story.